Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be. I am Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual policy forum. Here we are on Zoom again. I do hope that one of these days soon we'll be welcoming people to a seminar at IPI again, but for now we are doing this virtually once again, but that does have advantages, so we can bring in people from far and wide. This event serves to launch the recently published report by IPI Senior Policy Analyst Gretchen Baldwin, From Female Engagement Teams to Engagement Platoons, the Evolution of Gendered Community Engagement in UN Peace Operations. This event and the research project form part of IPI's dedicated Women, Peace and Security program. And I'd like to begin by thanking the Government of Canada's ELSI initiative, which has funded this work under IPI's multi-year Women in Peace Operations project. So really, let me express my gratitude for that. Gretchen's paper presents data on the prior activities of engagement teams and the experiences of those deployed to them. It aims to help decision makers align policies and guidance on engagement teams and engagement platoons with evidence of what has worked and perhaps what is not. The paper draws on extensive interviews with members of engagement teams and policymakers, as well as a detailed questionnaire distributed to military peacekeepers in 6 peacekeeping missions. And it concludes that to effectively implement engagement teams and platoons, leaders in missions and national militaries must address institutional barriers that preclude women's full participation in peace operations and perpetuate gendered stereotypes. This policy forum, we will discuss and learn from practitioners who will consider the operational challenges, gendered assumptions, and stereotypes that have negatively impacted the work of engagement teams and platoons, as well as the gendered and racialized assumptions and stereotypes about host communities. At one level, this may seem like a niche area of policy relevant only to a specific operational context, but as one reads the paper, which I highly recommend you do, it is available on our website, ipins.org. What became clear to me, what becomes clear, I think, as you read it, is that this work has a much broader significance. Why? Because as important as that specific operational context is, it also speaks to the much larger goals of the United Nations to be increasingly gender smart, gender responsive, and more people-centric in all of its work, in particular in the field. We have what I take is really a great panel to discuss all of this, and this will be moderated by my colleague, Dr. Phoebe Donnelly, IPI Research Fellow and head of our Women, Peace and Security program. But before we turn to Phoebe and the panel, I would like to turn to Ms. Gwyn Kutz, Director General of the Peace and Stabilization Operations Program at Global Affairs Canada, to deliver opening remarks. Gwyn, thanks again to Canada for your support and your government's leadership on this very important issue. Gwyn, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, and welcome everyone. And let me say thank you and congratulations to the fantastic team at IPI for this latest publication on gendered community engagement in UN peace operations. So Canada, through the ELSI initiative for Women in Peace Operations, is absolutely thrilled to support this work in order to create a more robust evidence base to cover the meaningful participation of uniformed women peacekeepers. And I'm so pleased to be here today with colleagues from Uruguay, from the United Nations, and the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, all of which are really important partners for us to help to address and to eliminate barriers to more representative and inclusive peace operations. So the publication being discussed today is both timely and relevant. With engagement platoons being part of the recently updated UN Infantry Battalion Manual, it's critical for the UN Secretariat and for member states to examine how stereotypes, biases, and assumptions will impact how uniformed military personnel interact with civilian communities. Gretchen, the author of this paper and the member of the IPI team working to support the ELC initiative, has provided an extremely valuable mapping of the history of engagement teams, their functions, valid critiques, and an idea of where these operational tools can take us into the future. Of course, the paper also contains important takeaways that reinforce what we're already learning through the ELC initiative, that community engagement is not up to women peacekeepers or engagement platoons alone, and that gendered and racialized assumptions about host communities exist, which show the importance of accurately assessing and reporting on the specific and complex needs that they have. The recommendations from the publication, such as better training for all military personnel, eliminating the idea that community engagement is suited for women only, improved reporting and coordination with engagement teams and platoons, and building the capacity of missions to engage with communities. These are all really important recommendations. The paper gives us an opportunity to consider how to invest in community engagement for UN peace operations. And this is something that the UN and Uruguay and Canada have closely collaborated on. This opportunity includes better approaches to train military men and women on skill sets that cover engagement needs, not only of women in host communities, but also of men, boys, girls, as well as gender and sexual minorities. Mission leaders and national militaries must also address the institutional barriers that impede women's full participation in peace operations and those that continue to perpetuate the unhelpful gendered stereotypes that Anna has just mentioned. At the UN Peacekeeping Ministerial in Seoul, Canada was delighted to announce a renewed and expanded ELC initiative over the next 5 years. So we look forward to continuing to listen to UN peacekeepers and the important message, which has been reiterated by IPI, that well-trained mixed gender teams have more diversity of thought, perspective, background, and experience to make peace operations better at what they do. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today, and I just want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kutz. Thank you, Adam. And thank you to the whole ELC team. It's been a really wonderful partnership working with you. And thank you for supporting this fantastic research. Thank you also to Gretchen for this paper where we've all learned so much. And my colleagues at IPI and on our Women, Peace and Security team, Masuma and Pashea, thank you for everyone's hard work to get this important research out there. It's my absolute pleasure to be moderating this event, and I'm very much looking forward to a rich discussion with our panel informed by Gretchen's research. I'm going to briefly introduce each of the panelists, but I will save the longer bios for when I turn to each of them for questions. So Gretchen Baldwin is a senior policy analyst in IPI's Women, Peace and Security program. Our other panelists, we have Colonel Stephanie Tutton, Chief of the OMA Policy and Doctrine Team at the United Nations Department of Peace Operations, Colonel Gonzalo Mila, Advisor to the Uruguayan Armed Forces, Lieutenant Yumai Amakoni, former Engagement Platoon Commander from the Uruguayan Army. So I'm going to turn the floor to Gretchen for a brief presentation on her research findings. I'll then pose some questions to each of our panelists, and then we'll conclude with an open Q&A session. So please feel free to submit your questions at any point during the panel. If you're joining us on the webinar, you can use the Q&A function, or if you're in any of our social media platforms, feel free to add questions via comments. So I will turn the floor to Gretchen.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. And I'll reiterate all the many thank yous without maybe going over them once again. Thank you everyone for being here. So I'll give a quick overview of the paper. And then, yeah, as Phoebe said, please do submit questions. It's a long report, so this is quite a summary. So happy to get into detail on any of the points therein for folks who want to discuss further. So in January of 2020, the United Nations Office of Military Affairs published the second edition of its Infantry Battalion Manual, or the UNIBAM. The new edition included the first ever guidance for engagement platoons, which, as some of the opening remarks highlighted, are mixed gender platoons comprised of a minimum of 50% women deployed explicitly for community engagement. This guidance is the first move toward institutionalizing the use of EPs, engagement platoons, as part of UN peace operations moves to be both more gender responsive and more people-centric. This formalization of EPs builds on years of ad hoc engagement teams. While UN records on ETs are effectively non-existent, my research shows they have been used ad hoc since at least 2015. In more recent years, their use has spread to most UN missions and has been linked by some, for better or for worse, to the UN's uniform gender parity goals. My research presents data on the prior activities of engagement teams and the experiences of those deployed to ETs in order to establish a baseline against which engagement platoons can be measured over time. For this presentation, I will first discuss the origins of engagement teams, followed by an overview of engagement teams' activities. I will then give an overview of the gendered assumptions underlying plans for both ETs and EPs, followed by some operational challenges that the EP's rollout may face, as well as suggestions for addressing those challenges. So to the origins of ETs, engagement teams, a lot of acronyms in this work. During the occupation of Afghanistan, the US military and its coalition partners used what are called female engagement teams, or FETs. So these are teams of women going into communities to speak with Afghan women and specifically gather intelligence and, quote, win hearts and minds. And they used these beginning as early as 2008. There are a couple of red flags from the Afghanistan example that I do want to raise, given that it's sort of fed into the UN's use of these teams. So there is little to no concrete, at least declassified data on the use of these teams. Likewise, members of the US, UK, and Australian militaries interviewed for this research were all skeptical of FET's effectiveness in Afghanistan. Accounts from that period are almost all from military sources, rather than sort of independent, external observers, and local perspectives are typically secondhand or third-hand accounts. And finally, in Afghanistan, FETs were typically used as part of heavily criticized counterinsurgency operations, which are not particularly relevant to UN operations mandates. So at the UN, engagement teams have tended to be the initiative of individual military women who had either experienced FETs in Afghanistan, either observing them or being part of them, or had the concept introduced to them in trainings by US military trainers. The latter type of interviewee indicated that when US troops discussed engagement teams, it was less to provide guidance or training on how to deploy engagement teams, but rather they used the female engagement team example as a sort of inspirational anecdote for the uniformed women in the training room. So now that I've given a brief overview of the origins, I do just want to give a note on terminology, because I know, again, there are a lot of acronyms. There tends to be a lot of uncertainty and a degree of disagreement about terms and definitions related to military community engagement. I'm going to be using the terms ET, engagement team, and EP, engagement platoon. ETs are currently in use at the UN and are expected to continue even as the more formalized EPs begin to deploy. EPs are not yet fully in circulation in UN peace operations, so I refer to them here. I'm almost always referring to future troop configurations. So what does this look like in practice? Interviews and questionnaires indicated 4 key categories of activities that engagement teams currently take on. These are information gathering, building trust and serving as positive examples, responding to CRSV and protecting civilians, CRSV is conflict-related sexual violence, and for providing ad hoc assistance in other areas. So for information gathering at the community level enables peacekeepers to analyze and respond to threats both to themselves and to the communities they are mandated to protect. Anecdotally, engagement teams have been characterized as an alert system for incidents specifically happening to women and children. They've also been cited as particularly important to tap into women in host communities' early warning potential for atrocities. Many of the women I interviewed who have deployed as members of engagement teams in UN peace operations, and particularly those who were the catalyst for engagement teams beginning at a particular mission, stated that they began doing this simply because no one was talking to local women prior. And a lot of UN leadership was not necessarily, seeing the value in speaking to the whole of the community, just given that men are typically seen as leaders in local communities. So despite the recognized potential of engagement teams accessing the full population, the teams are not necessarily well connected to the rest of the mission. Reporting lines are unclear, and most interviewees I spoke to indicated that even if engagement teams are collecting critical information, missions are ill-equipped to actually analyze and integrate that information into operational planning. So the second basket of activities is building trust and serving as positive examples. Women peacekeepers and engagement teams can build trust and relationships between the peacekeeping force and community members, and they can build confidence in the UN's mandate. Interviewees in MONUSCO stated that engagement teams normalize the face of the force and can act as a link to the gender focal point, who can then address community members' problems more fully. Likewise, many in the UN system characterize women peacekeepers more broadly, even outside of community engagement activities, as positive examples or role models for women in host communities. Despite an outsized focus on uniformed women, many of the skills that interviewees pointed to, which they say contribute to engagement teams' effectiveness in building trust, are not specific to women. For example, both interviewees and questionnaire respondents emphasize language skills as essential for effective community engagement. Even just having basic phrases in a local language can help establish a rapport between peacekeepers and community members of all genders. The third basket of activities is responding to conflict-related sexual violence and protecting civilians. Because of stigmas against sexual violence, third-party actors like UN peacekeepers can be important resources for reporting as well as for protection. However, there's little concrete data on whether engagement teams are more or less effective than other troops at community engagement related to CRSV, despite responding to CRSV being consistently named as one of the primary justifications for engagement teams' use. Troop contributing country and UNHQ policymakers and leadership have pointed to the importance of ETs and EPs for addressing human rights violations and improving protection of civilians. However, most interviewees who were currently deployed to ETs at the time of our interview indicated that this is not currently one of the main objectives of ETs in practice, and there really isn't training for that. They suggested that if ETs and EPs are to play a greater role in protection going forward, they will need to shift their operational goals, communicate those goals to infantry members, and provide training. Similarly, less than a quarter of questionnaire respondents noted protection as one of the activities that ETs carry out. The fourth and final basket of activities is providing ad hoc assistance in various other areas. So engagement teams have been reported as taking on humanitarian or development aid related projects, often as a secondary activity, the primary activity still being information gathering or other mandate related tasks. These activities included public health campaigns, building projects, economic advancement and vocational trainings, and miscellaneous educational tasks. And more recently, it seems engagement teams have been at some missions quite responsive with the COVID-19 pandemic, so carrying out health sensitizations and COVID awareness raising campaigns, for example. These activities do typically fall outside of military mandates and risk blurring the lines between civilian and military peacekeepers. And this was an issue with the FETs in Afghanistan as well. A common critique. Diffusing engagement teams' responsibilities by using them in such an ad hoc manner to support community development projects or humanitarian responses may also hinder those teams from developing a more specialized skill set, and it could lead them to engage in activities for which they lack trainings. So I'd like to very quickly, with all of those activities in mind, go into just very briefly the gendered assumptions embedded in engagement teams. So there are two baskets here. So gendered assumptions about women peacekeepers first. Women peacekeepers deployed to ETs or EPs face two overarching assumptions that can impact their work. The first is that they are inherently better at conducting community engagement activities than their male counterparts. And the second is that they require more protection than male peacekeepers. And the second basket here is gendered assumptions about host communities. And Ms. Kutz spoke to some of this in her opening remarks, so thank you so much for that. Irrespective of the gender of the peacekeepers themselves, justifications for gendered community engagement may perpetuate harmful and sometimes racist stereotypes about women in host communities, particularly in Africa. Likewise, stereotypes may keep peacekeepers from considering or understanding the gendered protection concerns held by civilian men in host communities and the need to do gendered community engagement with men because men also have a gender identity. So from there, I'll briefly go over the operational challenges that may face the continuation of engagement teams as well as the engagement platoons rollout. And I'll follow that with some ways that we can potentially address those operational challenges. So the first challenge is training. It's always training. So there's no standardized engagement teams training as of now, though there probably should be, given that it will take a long time for engagement teams to be fully replaced by engagement platoons. For engagement platoons, the UNIBAM guidance includes a training package, which was just piloted in Rwanda in September of 2021 after COVID significantly delayed the process for a while. And I hope that Colonel Tutton will maybe get into some more detail about that training for us. The training will now be adjusted based on observer assessment so that the engagement platoon handbook, which will be a more detailed document guiding the deployment of engagement platoons. So the handbook and the training package can hopefully be distributed to TCCs sometime this year. Another major operational challenge facing this is securing individual and institutional buy-in. So advocates for the EP's development have often met resistance in military decision-making structures. Buy-in for engagement platoons, like so many gender initiatives, is dependent on individual leaders, often both at HQ and in the field, as well as the determination and dedication of those individuals advocating for change. Personality-driven processes mean things are not necessarily institutionalized or always seen through to the end. So a couple of ways that we can address these operational challenges: integrating engagement teams into missions and connecting them to HQ. So reporting needs to be streamlined, particularly given that information gathering is the top objective. As it should be, in my opinion. Reports from engagement teams are often lost within the regular reporting to sector HQ, meaning that any specialized information gathered by ETs is being underutilized at best and completely lost at worst. And finally, there is consistently a capacity issue, which I think everyone here is familiar with. But for example, I would speak to forced gender advisors who are very keen to, try to improve the engagement teams model, but those advisors don't have a staff. And so it's really up to one person who has, of course, many, many other responsibilities beyond this one thing. And then the other way to address some of these operational challenges that I think is fairly clear and hopefully fairly straightforward for the UN is documenting and reporting on the work of ETs and consistency in handovers. So reporting systems need to incorporate filters in the SAGE system, for example, that distinguish which reports are coming from EPs versus regular infantry units. And to address handover challenges, one very simple example that has come out of MINUSCO recently is that MINUSCO will be issuing engagement teams a SIM card, a mobile phone, and a shared email address in order to allow teams to retain institutional knowledge and local contacts over time. So it will take time to transition to mixed gender engagement platoons, even for troop contributing countries that are already deploying engagement teams. During this transition period from ad hoc engagement teams to institutionalized EPs, the Office of Military Affairs, missions, and troop contributing countries must pay attention to and record the ongoing activities of existing ETs, as well as closely monitor and analyze EPs' trainings and initial deployments. EPs have the potential to be incredibly effective in bringing host community needs closer to UN peace operations mandates if UN and TCC leadership are willing to make adjustments based on real data rather than gendered assumptions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gretchen. And just to echo Adam's earlier comments, please do check out Gretchen's full report where, she gave us just a brief summary, but there's a wealth of data in there and some great visuals. And so I really recommend that. And apologies, I was so excited to get to Gretchen's presentation. I did not read her full bio, but Gretchen Baldwin is a senior policy analyst in IPI's Women, Peace, and Security program, where she leads the Women in Peace Operations research track. Prior to joining the Women, Peace, and Security team, Gretchen was the assistant editor at IPI, and she's been with the organization since September 2018. Before joining IPI, Gretchen was an AC4 graduate fellow conducting field research on sustainable peace in Rwanda, as well as a Fulbright student researcher in Northern Cameroon. So we'll hear more from Gretchen later, but I wanted to be sure to give her background. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Colonel Stephanie Tutton. Colonel Tutton is currently seconded to the United Nations Office of Military Affairs as the Chief of Policy and Doctrine. She was deployed to Bamako, Mali as the Command Group Advisor to the MINUSMA Force Commander, from late 2018 through early 2020. Her responsibilities included oversight of the advisors and special staff, strategic reporting to the United Nations, and budget management. Prior to her deployment, she served at the Joint Staff in the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. So Colonel Tutton, I know there's so much we want to ask you, and we'll definitely get to multiple questions, but just to kick us off, we were hoping you could tell us more about how UN headquarters plans to assess the initial rollout of engagement platoons, and how might community feedback be solicited and integrated to inform assessment of their effectiveness? What kinds of reporting and analysis strategies will be effective in assessing the work of engagement platoons? So Colonel Tutton, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Donnelly. I truly appreciate that. Pretty tough questions to start out with, but what I'd like to say is there are a lot of terms out there. We have engagement, community engagement, female engagement teams, military engagement teams, engagement platoons, community or gendered community engagement. But what I'd really like to emphasize from my position as Chief of Policy and Doctrine is that engagement is everyone's responsibility. The uniformed components, the civilians, mission leaders, even here at the UN headquarters. And really, one way to look at this is any type of communication, whether it's written, a dialogue, a debate, negotiations, that's all engagement. But the emphasis here is engagement platoons are not standalone. They are and should be part of the work of the infantry battalion. And the Office of Military Affairs does not generate platoons or teams. We will force generate contingents or units at the battalion level. And then the engagement platoon is part of that. So when we think of infantry battalions, and let's think of them in very general terms for this discussion here, we can start with the planning aspect. For example, the military planning of a patrol. It could be a security patrol to keep people in an area or out of an area, or a presence patrol simply to observe what's happening, or to secure a road or a helicopter landing site, which are absolutely military tasks. And by default, there's an effect on the population or on those groups that observe this, whether it's children, men, or women who just simply see that patrol. There are good things and positive effects that come out of that and that are achieved. It could be simply the blue helmet is observed or visible. There could be improved trust or confidence in the work of the United Nations, or the VIP from the helicopter is simply brought to the village to have a discussion, and it's a civilian that the military is escorting for some reason. This all supports the UN and the mandates and the goals and objectives. And that's the first and immediate benefit or focus is generally on the UN's goals or objectives. Part of the EP concept, the engagement platoon concept, is to shift that focus to the local population first, to be able to bring the local population's needs, requirements into the infantry battalion's planning process. I'm not saying that this isn't already part of the battalion's planning process now. The EPs have been designed to place their focus on that portion of the planning for the infantry battalions to further improve the overall effect on the ground, whether that's for simply security tasks, and I shouldn't say simply, for security tasks, protection of civilians, integration with the humanitarian actors in the mission, or simply for improved community engagement by the entire battalion. And I keep emphasizing the entire battalion. You specifically asked about the initial rollout. Gretchen mentioned it. We did have the initial pilot course in Rwanda. I would say that it was partially successful. We are actually going to do a second validation course. Canada has been very, very supportive of the development of the training package, which is a reinforcement training package for the infantry battalion because the Unabomb has the specialized training materials. One of the assessments will be a subtle difference, and Gretchen's paper alluded to this, or at least there's 2 lines in her paper that I highlighted, underlined, and circled. One of the assessments will be on the subtle difference of patrolling with an engagement platoon or an engagement team, or those who have patrolled as members of an engagement platoon or engagement team. Very different but it's very subtle to figure out what that difference is. We will be looking for stereotypes. We absolutely do not want to stereotype women into that's women's work or the women are the ones that have to engage. It is responsibility of all UN peacekeepers, men, women, civilians, uniformed, etc. So I will stop there, and I'm sure there will be further discussions, but thank you.
Thank you. And I think that's a great takeaway. Engagement is everyone's responsibility. I underlined that, bolded, and circled. So thank you, Colonel Tutton. We're going to now turn the floor to Colonel Gonzalo Mila. He's currently serving as Special Advisor on Peace Operations at Uruguay's National Support System for Peace Operations. He retired from the Army in January 2015, where he has had a wide-ranging military career, including duties as battalion and brigade commander. Colonel Mila is working at Uruguay's DoD, developing the National Action Plan for the implementation of Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. He's also supporting the development of the UN Engagement Platoon Handbook and the training material for the UN Infantry Battalion. So Colonel Mila, I'd like to ask you, how can the UN and military leaders encourage buy-in from military TCCs to implement engagement platoons training at the national level and institutionalize engagement platoons in UN peace operations? What are some of the challenges and opportunities you've identified through Uruguay's experience with introducing and deploying engagement platoons? Mila, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And first, I want to congratulate EP team for this report, and especially Gretchen, because I think this is a very good document that will help a lot everybody to understand the evolution of from FED to engagement platoon and how we had to implement it in the field. I will start talking, and I am aligned with the Colonel Stephanie Tutton said about the engagement. I think it's very important that everybody, the leaders from the government and from the military, they had to understand the engagement concept in the POC environment. This is something very important. And as she said, this is a full battalion responsibility, all battalion responsibility. But coming from the experience from the field, I was also battalion commander in Congo. When we are in the field, when we approach to village cities, we are always talking with leaders, some reference. And in those very male-dominated society, we only speak with men. And it's very difficult, and it was explained by Gretchen in the report, it's very difficult to talk for male soldiers with women. Of course, women have the same right of men to be part of the infantry battalion, but sometimes for male it's difficult to approach the women in the field. And I think in coming from our experience, and probably Lieutenant Amakoni will talk about that, it's much easier for women to talk with women. But the most important thing coming from the concept is that everybody have to keep in mind the need to have the capability to get information, to develop a good gender-based analysis, to better understand the society in the field. With that information, we will be better prepared. We will better plan our operation to better protect the local population, and taking in mind that we should be very, very more centered people approach. And one of our barriers when we start to prepare this, the FED training that was the first in 2018, then we evolved to engagement platoon in 2019, and Amakoni was part of this team, and now we already finished the third training. When we start to tell the leaders, okay, we will incorporate an engagement team or engagement platoon in the infantry battalion, and we will remove people from your maneuver company to vacate place for that that platoon, that was the stronger barrier. They say, why? We don't need that. We already have the capability to do that. And they are not infantry. And we will lose our operational capability. And it is not the case. That will not happen. And one of the requirements that I made, you know, as an old colonel, I had the right to talk with the Army command, say, okay, we will do that, but we need to have in the room during the course all the chain of command, the staff officers and all the company commanders and platoon commanders, because they will be in the field and they will use the engagement platoon. And that was right, was one of the good lesson learned coming from us, because they were able to understand the concept of engagement and the use of engagement platoon. And coming from the war, or the statement say from the former battalion commander to the platoon, the engagement platoon commander, Lieutenant Amakoni, and he recognized it at the end of the mission that he was a little bit skeptic about the introducing the engagement platoon in the battalion. But at the end, he said that following that course, he understood exactly the concept of engagement, the use of engagement platoon. It's allowed him to include in the battalion operation the use of engagement platoon, and that was much better for the battalion. They developed a stronger capability for that. So this is one of our recommendations to break down that barrier, is to teach not only the engagement platoon that will be deployed, that fortunately we will have the handbook and the training material, but the most important is to teach all the chain of command to learn how to use this the engagement platoon. And I think it's all. I think this is the last thing is maybe something for OMA. So Colonel Tutton, maybe we should start to update the MOU and the standard unit requirement to include in the organization signed by the countries that they had to introduce the engagement platoon, and it should be mandatory for them. And in the standard unit requirement, I think it's important it should be included, because all the commander will know in the field that they have to include this resource and to use it. Even though they are not infantry soldiers, but they have some basic combat skill, but they have a lot of skill that we need to conduct a very good gender-based analysis, which will be necessary to better protect the population. So thank you, Phoebe.
Thank you so much. And we really appreciate your sharing your experience and some really actionable recommendations. And also it's wonderful to hear the need for good gender analysis on, societies and host communities, something that Gretchen and I constantly think about and talk about, getting that good, strong gender analysis. So our final panelist for the first round is Lieutenant Yumai Amakoni. She's the former MONUSCO Urabat Engagement Platoon Commander. She was the first woman deployed as an engagement platoon commander in Uruguay. Lieutenant Amakoni has significant experience as a peacekeeper, including 2 operational peacekeeping missions in MONUSCO from 2017 to 2018 and 2020 to 2022. She is a paramedic and an instructor of paramedics. And Lieutenant Amakoni, we were hoping you could tell us more about your personal experience patrolling with engagement teams or engagement platoons. What lessons and best practices can you draw from that experience that could support and inform how engagement teams are trained and deployed across UN missions? So I'm going to turn the floor over to Lieutenant Amakoni. One more reminder, please do submit questions in the Zoom Q&A or on social media, and we will get our panelists to answer those shortly. Thank you, Lieutenant Amakoni. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Phoebe. I have to say that I agree every word with Colonel Mila, because as we discussed before, it is very important the participant of all the chain of command to understand the importance of the engagement platoon, engagement teams. And in my personal experience, patrolling with the engagement teams was a very hard year for us because we had the COVID pandemic in our battalion and also the eruption of the volcano. So that made our work very hard. I have to say that before that, we were lucky to deploy engagement teams to several villages in Beni City, Boikene village, and Fataki. During this period, the city, I'm speaking about Beni, was under a security alert that made it very difficult to carry out all the activities that we were previously planned. But we were able to hold some meetings with local and ecclesiastical authorities in order to introduce our team, to explain our mission. And we also participated in night mounted patrols and on foot patrols. My teams was integrated by a female doctor. I think this is very important because I was able to choose my personnel. It was a female doctor, a psychologist, a member of the battalion CMIC, and a local female interpreter. This is, I think, one of the most important persons in the team. Because through speaking to her, we were able to engage with the women and with the children of this village. During our deployment, we were able to measure the impact of our presence in the field. Because at the beginning, we saw this anti-MONUSCO feeling in the Beni city, and the local population were upset because we were there, and they were saying that we don't want you here. And by the end of our mission, people were asking if we could stay longer. They knew our names, and they even were saying like hola to us, like we say in Spanish. So it was very, very good for us to see this reaction of the population. They felt safer, as they say, and more comfortable with us, with the women particularly. So I think it's very important to carefully select the personnel who will integrate the engagement teams. And in our case, we receive a pre-deployment training, as Colonel Gonzalo Mila was saying. And that was very important to set the basis for our work in the field. But the challenge for me was that the people who received the training wasn't available in the field. They had another duties and other missions, and they weren't able. So I had to take all these people and to give them some lessons, some classes, and to train them in the field. Like I said, having this important background that our peacekeeping school gave us before the deployment. During our deployment in Beni, we were able to gather necessary information for the operations. And I think that we were used as a tactical tool to disseminate information also, because most of the people in the village, they didn't know what we were doing there. So we explained to them what we are doing, what our job was. I think that was a very strategic point to our commander, because he was able to collect all this information and to use it in the benefits of the MONUSCO and the battalion particularly. I have to say that one of the challenges that we faced also was the support of our male colleagues, because during this evacuation of a volcano, we have to evacuate civilians, staff, and international MONUSCO personnel. And the people were speaking to me and my colleagues, my male colleagues, they were saying to me, why the people is talking to you? And I say, okay, let them speak to whom they feel more comfortable. And I think that was one of the challenges we faced. About what you say, Phoebe, about the lessons and best practices. One of the lessons that is that the personnel have to be qualified for the task. Like I say, doctors, psychologists, social workers, CIMIC personnel, with basic language skills, because this is very important even for us. To involve the engagement platoon leaders during planning of operation, I think that to consider our point of view is very important. to adopt standard reporting formats, because after our missions, I have any report, any format, previous format to report to my commander. So I have to invent one and to say to him, this is only the thing I have. This standardized report format should not stop engagement platoons from listening any discussion as a way to build the trust as we speak. I think that even the deployment duration can be challenging for us, because in our case, Uruguayan Battalion is the Force Commander Reserve. So it's difficult to have an engagement team on the field due to our deployment is for a short period of time. So it's hard to engage a long-term, in a long term with the people. Let me see. The importance of training, not during, before mission, also during the mission. And one thing that I saw that it was important is to have a specialized personnel to create a photograph register in a respectful way, because we were doing our task and our mission, and we need to take this register with a personnel that is qualified in that matter. So I think this is all the most important things that I could gather from my experience during this period in mission.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and that really detailed recommendations and lessons. It's very useful. So we have a few questions that have come in. I'm going to kind of direct them to panelists, but if anyone wants to add to something that's been said, definitely please do feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. So the first question I'm going to direct to Gretchen, because I think this underlies a lot of the discussion and kind of thinking within the report. So while there is a recognition of FETs and ETs as a way to build trust with host nations, does this not also operationalize gender as a way to achieve military objectives? So Gretchen, I know this is a big topic, but we'd love kind of some thoughts you can share and how you thought about this.
Definitely. So this is thank you so much for this question. I mean, it's a tough one, and in all honesty, it's something that I wrestle with often as a researcher who works on the military and also certainly does not want to advance militarism globally. So first of all, I mean, I think it's important to note that gender is present in military operations and interactions and, planning and everything. Gender is just present always. And so there is a difference between acknowledging it and sort of operationalizing it, right? And so I think it's really important to point to gendered engagement that happens within military operations. But yes, certainly without operationalizing it to sort of justify militarization or further securitization. So I think with regard specifically to engagement teams and platoons, one way to address this and hopefully avoid operationalizing gender for military objectives is for engagement platoons particularly, but sorry, I'm going to back that up actually. For engagement teams, especially because they're so ad hoc, to really stick to very particular goals. So I believe I said this in my presentation, but I'll double down on it. I feel quite strongly that protection-related mandates and information gathering are like the two things that make sense for engagement platoons and teams to be dealing with. Information gathering above all else. They're very well positioned. Lieutenant Amakoni's own experience really highlights this, right? Like engagement teams and engagement platoons are really well positioned to gather information that is specifically going to be used toward the protection, the more effective protection of civilians, as well as more effective protection of UN peacekeepers themselves. These lines begin to blur, and I think the worrying sort of trends toward securitizing gender begin to happen when the lines become blurred between military and civilian peacekeepers. And that is a huge problem. That's, again, when I brought up these sort of ad hoc activities that ETs have taken on in the past. Again, this is not, it's not sinister, right? I mean, everyone I spoke to, all my interviewees who indicated that they took on ad hoc sort of development related projects had really good intentions. You know, the short-term effect was largely positive, but overall, over time, the long-term effect is that uniforms and civilians become confused. And so if engagement platoons and teams can be utilized to gather information, to consider gender in a nuanced way within communities, with the ultimate goal of improving protection, right? Rather than sort of improving the military image. And then that information can get back to the relevant civilian entities and potentially even UN police entities who can then carry out more long-term projects, right? With longer sort of tours of duty at mission and that sort of thing. Then I think we won't eliminate operationalizing gender, right, or securitizing gender, but we can at least minimize it. So I hope that it's a bit of a convoluted answer. I think about this a lot, and I'm constantly bothered by it and upset by the complicated nature of the question. But it's something that we should all be questioning on a regular basis. So thank you for that question.
Great, thank you. So the next questions are coming from Cecilia Quimba from the Zambia Police Service, who has experience working in UN peacekeeping. And she asks, I'm going to direct her first question to Colonel Tutton and her second question maybe to Colonel Mila. And, you know, again, feel free to do chime in. So the first question she asks are there any trainings planned by the UN headquarters for police contributing countries on the concept, importance, and roles of ETs and EPs and UN and AU missions prior to deployment? And then after Colonel Tutton takes that question, I would like to ask Colonel Mila her second question: which missions currently have ETs and EPs, but maybe more to your experience, if you can talk about how effective also are they in mandate implementation in those missions? So thinking of the role with ETs and EPs and mandate implementation. So we'll start with Colonel Tutton and then move to Colonel Mila.
Okay, thank you. Can I just add one thing to what Gretchen is saying? Along those same lines, one of the things that I have struggled with inside of the Office of Military Affairs is the phraseology of women's meaningful participation in peacekeeping. Sometimes that means under the mandates, it is having more women from the local population at the negotiating table, or women's organizations within a host country that are part of reestablishing the governmental infrastructure, etc. I may have frozen. Can you still hear me? Okay. And the other one is women's meaningful participation, where you put the UN women's meaningful participation in peacekeeping. That phrase is me. It's the ability on the military side to have a senior colonel from her national military as one of the leaders inside of the Office of Military Affairs. Or it is me being assigned as the command group advisor, advising the force commander of the MINUSMA force headquarters, things like that. So sometimes we shift back and forth, and I think that sometimes sometimes causes problems with the understanding of what's operationalizing gender and what's not. So I add that with that. That's another phrase that's out there that we continue to work on. So now the question about police, I will be perfectly honest with you. My answer will be pretty quick. No, right now there is nothing planned with police contributing countries. I will let you know that I have had a discussion, albeit it was several months ago, probably 6 to 8 months ago now, with the policy team over in UNPOL that I work with. And there's a little bit different mandate for the police. They have a concept of community policing. The military doesn't have that same military task or function. So I think the police get to community engagement, community policing a little bit quicker than the military does. And a lot of the police mandates also have a capacity building part of their mandate where the military generally does not. So I say those two things. I will absolutely bring this up the next time I have one of my policy discussions with the policy teams here in the UN to see where and how the police and the military under that uniformed component umbrella can synchronize our efforts, and if there's anything that we can send across to the police as best practice or lessons learned. But I do believe it would probably have to be modified based on the differences between the police and the military. Thank you.
Well, about the second question, I'm very sorry because I don't have precise information. Maybe Gretchen can help me with that. But as far as I know, we have a female engagement team that was the first deployment in 2015 in Central African Republic. Then we have a number of engagement platoon in DRC, in Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm not sure if we already deploy engagement platoon in Mali and in Lebanon. I don't know if there are others, but the question is, I think the most important part is how effective are they? It's difficult to say right now if they are effective or not. But I believe that first, we need to continue with the initiative to increase the women, the incorporation of women in the armed forces in each country. This will allow us to have women to be deployed in the field. The engagement platoon is aligned with that concept, but we should not think that when we deploy engagement platoon is because we want to increase the women participation. It will contribute with that, but it's not the fact. The fact is that we need to improve, as I mentioned at the beginning of my statement, my remark, is to improve the engagement capability. And coming from our experience from Uruguay, we are including women in our deployment since a long time ago. But in DRC, we are there since 2001. From 2006 to now, our average of women in that unit is around the 6-7% of women. It depends on our capability. Of course, the majority of them are doing administrative, logistic, and sanitary tasks. But more and more, we are including them in the combat operation. On combat activity, not combat operation, because in all our deployment, we include women, and that women had been engaged in our contact with population. That is one of the reasons that Lieutenant Amakoni say she incorporated doctor, because it's very important. This is our good way to approach with population, having a doctor that can not provide medical assistance, because this is not our task, but they can facilitate, they can understand, and they can facilitate the sanitary assistance then through the CIMIC officers. But how effective are they? I cannot say you how effective are they, but they are effective. And our activity are improving a lot. So we need to encourage people to do that. Each country have different approach so far, but I think from the STM that will be approved, I think next month in Uganda, having the handbook, we will have the same approach, and that will be good for future deployment. Thank you.
Thank you. So picking up on that, I'm going to turn to Lieutenant Amakoni. The question is, how did you measure the effectiveness of the patrols, and what kind of information did you collect or share?
Okay, respect the measurement of the effectiveness. We were able to do that because of like I said before, because of the change in the anti-MONUSCO feeling. Once we got into the village, they were refusing to speak to us. They were saying, go home, MONUSCO. They were saying like this, go home, MONUSCO. So we were very impressed because of that reaction through us. And during a long period of time, like maybe 1 month, 2 months, the people started to speak to us. The women were more approachable to us, and we were feeling more comfortable speaking to everyone in the village. So, like I said, before we left, everyone was saying, can you stay longer? Because everything is getting calm when you are here, because we were doing these patrols and this thing. And the population said that everything was calm since we were there. And about the kind of information we were able to collect, it's about the armed groups, where they operate, how they operate, what times during the day or during the night, so we can plan our patrols in that specific times. And the needs of the village, they express to us the needs they have, and that's all the kind of information we were able to gather.
Thank you. And I'd love to kind of switch the order and ask you another question, Lieutenant Amakoni. Someone said to please comment, and you touched on this in your remarks just now in your opening remarks, but can you comment on the acceptance and support you receive from the peacekeeping missions, both the substantive and administrative sides?
Yeah, I think we receive a lot of support. Actually, I had some meetings with the gender advisor, with child protection section, and they were very supportive, and to share the information we were able to gather, like I said, not only with my battalion, but through the civilian way. And I think the level of acceptance was very good.
Great, thank you. So Gretchen, I'm gonna field a question to you that you also touched on in your opening remarks, but we'd like to hear more about. Could you speak about existing evidence or lack of regarding engagement teams and engagement platoons being more effective, or I guess not more effective, dealing with conflict-related sexual violence and protection situations than other troops?
Sure, Chloe, this will be a short answer, unfortunately. I wish that I could comment more. There just is very little information. So this gets back to Colonel Mila's comments actually from a couple of minutes ago. It is so difficult to assess the difference right now between these teams and platoons and other infantry battalion members, that a lot of the justifications for their use are just very difficult to back up with actual data. So this is why one of the things that I really want to push from this report, one of the key findings, is that we need better reporting and evaluation. We need consistent reporting, and not just with the rollout of engagement platoons. As I said, this needs to begin now with existing engagement teams. It's harder because they're ad hoc, and there's probably, I mean, I would leave this to Stephanie, of course, but I would imagine there's not a real chance of getting like UN-wide guidance on this, because that would take a really long time. But there really, really needs to be consistent reporting. So things as small as within the SAGE system, creating a filter that allows for reports from engagement teams or engagement platoons to be flagged as coming from engagement teams or platoons, right? So just distinguishing between who is doing the reporting, so that even if the UN doesn't have a system for analyzing the difference right now, over time, ideally independent researchers such as myself, or UN consultants, mission personnel, someone can come in and at least have that information available. And that's really, I mean, from my perspective, just given, again, like capacity limitations and sort of the way the system is structured, that is the most realistic way, I think, that we're going to begin to get toward what the different effectiveness is. Other than that, we just, yeah, it's really tough to say. So I'm sorry, it's not a more satisfying answer, but thanks for the question.
Thank you. There are so many great questions in the Q&A. So thank you all, and apologies if we can't get to them. I'm trying to kind of call through, see if we can get through some different topics. So Deb Warren-Smith from the Elsie Initiative Fund asked Colonel Tutton, Colonel Tutton, you talked about the EP training conducted last year and that it was partially successful. Could you tell us more on the lessons learned from this, feedback from the participants, and how the next course will be updated?
Well, so that was my opinion, Stephanie Tutton. I probably, being part of the UN, I should have said it was a 100% success. The part of the reason that I say that it was a partial success is because the team that we sent out from the Office of Military Affairs and Canada, we had two things that we learned. One, we had a little bit too much, and I hope this is under Chatham House rules, we had a little bit too much NATO inside of this doctrine. Some of our annexes in the EP handbook are quite sophisticated, and we're working right now to simplify those and make sure that they fit the UN context of peacekeeping, peace operations, truly protection of civilians. The second piece that we realized through this is that the understanding of protection of civilians is wide and varied. The force commanders may think of it one way, the commander on the ground may see it a different way. When I speak to the protection of civilians section, they tell me something every day that I learn that I didn't realize because I haven't read all of the papers that they've drafted or all of the research that they've done on protection of civilians. So those were probably the two big things. And when we tell an engagement platoon, which is part of an infantry battalion, to go do protection of civilians, and we're unable to really explain it from the OMA headquarters, the doctrine side, all the way down to a platoon, there's a gap in the doctrine, and there needs to be more clarity and understanding there. And one of the things that we run into is, again, what I said before, we force generate at the battalion level, and I'm being asked to draft doctrine for a very tactical platoon. So it's a little bit of a difference in how we are drafting doctrine that I'm trying to work through with the team and the project lead. And one statement that also came out during the pilot course in Rwanda was this: wait a minute, we've been doing engagement for the last 20 years. What, you're coming in here to train me on engagement? What are you doing? And it was just about like that is how it was relayed back to me. And I could see that I had, in quotes, offended the people who are participating, since I was able to give just a couple points at the beginning of this whole thing to say, hey, we're in here, we're going to teach you about engagement and how to do it. And they were like, we've been doing this. What are you going to come in and tell me? So I don't think we took into account the lessons of the infantry battalion, and so there was part of that, but then I think it was also a delivery with the team, with the instructor team, and we've worked very hard with Canada to modify that. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Colonel Tutton, for your openness about that and thinking about it in the future. Colonel Mila, I wanted to ask you a question. Oh, it might have just disappeared off my screen. Let's see. The question was around if you could talk more about how the information from engagement teams is different from other type of information that might be coming in, particularly from like community liaison assistance. You know, what's really unique about this information gathering and the type of information that is gathered?
Okay, good question. In fact, they are not much different, but all that information should be focused on the human environment to understand the human situation. The liaison assistant, of course, is a very good resource that we have with our unit in the field. They are local and they have much better approach than us to the community. They belong to civil affairs unit. and they are appointed to the battalion in the field. Engagement platoon is part of the battalion. They work under the battalion commander direction, and they have the capability to engage the population, but also to get information that could be good for the intelligence point of view, to improve our protection capabilities, but also to the CIMIC point of view, to give a resource to better approach in their coordination, and of course, to better or to improve the battalion capability to make a good gender-based analysis, to understand the different level of population, male, women, children, girls, boys, different age, different religion, different society, different ethnic minorities, because there are a lot of minorities suffering problems. Of course, community engagement, liaison assistant, but engagement platoon is part of the battalion resource. And they should work in close coordination because, of course, they have good information, but the battalion should develop that capability. And with the engagement platoon, we give the battalion or we make the commanders to think about that more precisely than that within the protection of civilian operation. I don't know if this is clear.
Great, thank you. And Lieutenant Amakoni, did you want to come in at all on that as well and share kind of a bit about information gathering from your perspective?
Yeah, it's like I think I answered here to the people who ask about this information. I think the language assistant is a very important piece in the engagement team. In the engagement team confirmation, because we are able to get this approach to the population that gave us, I mean, not the other information is not the main task, but it's very good for our operations and to know what's going on the field. Language assistant doesn't have the training that we have as engagement teams. So it's a joint work that we have to do, actually, with the class, with us.
Great, thank you so much. Another question that came in is how, and I'm not sure, okay. Sorry, I have two questions I want to make sure to get to. The first is around, I believe it's around translation and translators, which has come up a lot. And the question was, the issue of local language is a reoccurring issue for peacekeeping operations. And when the EP concept note was developed, it was noted that additional translators should be factored into the planning. Is the UN proactively looking to increase the number of translators to give the engagement platoons for use, or is the concept to keep at the translators at the battalion level? So I'm going to turn to Gretchen. I know this came up in the report, and to Stephanie as well, if you want to. I know you commented in the chat, but not all of our viewers can see the questions answered in the chat. So we'll turn Gretchen and then Colonel Tutton.
Thanks, Phoebe. So I'll, of course, let Stephanie touch on what the UN plans to do. But I do just want to flag that in my research, so this is a hugely important point, right? And thanks, Colin, for bringing it up. So as I mentioned, language skills are super essential. And then I believe it was Lieutenant Amakoni also highlighted that duration of deployments can be a real challenge as far as building those language skills, building trust over time, right? Like all of these things really sort of clash at different points. So I just wanted to highlight from my research that the need for translators at the community level was actually one of the most consistent things that interviewees brought up. And they specifically raised the fact that recruiting more women translators from communities has been, at least anecdotally, very successful as far as helping to facilitate the activities of engagement teams. at mission level. And, you know, when you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, right? If the argument is, you know, we're trying to be gender sensitive, gender responsive, you know, potentially trying to discuss sexual violence, which means, you know, much of the time, if you're a man who's experienced sexual violence, you may want to speak to a man. You may also want to speak to a woman, but not necessarily from your own community. And if you're a woman who's experienced sexual violence, you're likely going to want to speak to another woman. And that all goes out the window. You know, you're deploying uniformed women, military women to conduct these interviews. That all goes out the window if you then have a man translating, right? Like that's not like the key point of bringing in women for that particular activity is just lost. So yeah, so I'll turn to Stephanie, of course, to actually give the you know, the UN perspective on that. But I just wanted to highlight that finding from the research that, you know, uniformed personnel and mission level personnel are really highlighting the need for translators, but particularly for a diverse range of translators, right? So that you consider the fact that like the UN level changes that you might be making to be more gender responsive are only as good as the, you know, efforts that you make at the local staff level as well.
So I don't have too much to answer. What I had put in my answer to whoever can see the chat, I have been involved in a very preliminary discussion related to CLAs, and I say CLAs because sometimes they're community liaison assistants and sometimes they're community language assistants. So internally, the UN has a little bit of difficulty with terminology. And the other part of this is what we're trying to do is figure out exactly what the purpose of the CLA is to be able to put that into some sort of policy document. And I'm using policy. It could be a guidance document. I don't know. Probably a policy document. The second part of this is military has absolutely nothing to say about who gets recruited, or the military doesn't recruit CLAs. That has to be done through the mission side at the local level. And there's some difficulties there because this is a scarce resource. It would be fantastic to have a language assistant, I'll say it that way, is particularly a community language assistant that understands the local dialect with every single military unit we have out there, every single FPU police unit we have out there, et cetera. But I just don't think that that's realistic. So it will probably always remain as a scarce resource. The other part of this is there are armed groups in several of the missions that when they find a village or community or an individual person who is friendly to the UN, they become a target. And so the UN then has a responsibility for CLAs to ensure their personal security and protection. So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect is this is a civilian, and to embed a civilian inside of a military contingent requires a little bit of legal review and oversight just to make sure that it's done properly. So the beginning of the discussions are there. That doesn't really, we're beginning, but again, that's not in my wheelhouse. It's a higher level than where I sit right now. Thanks.
Thank you, Colonel Tutton and Gretchen. So we have kind of questions left that touch on two different themes. And I think they're encapsulated really well in Colonel Roberto Gill's question. So I'm going to read that question and I'm going to have each of the panelists answer this question or talk about any closing remarks related to this question or otherwise. And we're going to go in reverse order. So we're going to start with Lieutenant Amakoni, go to Colonel Mila, Colonel Tutton, and then Gretchen will have the last word before turning back to me. So the question is, and I think this is a great way to end this panel, is thinking about the way forward. So the question is, the only comment is about the way forward, considering the national realities in which female participation in the security forces is very relative and that this reality is projected in the same proportion to peace operations, my question is what and how to get the project moving forward in consolidating the engagement platoons working for the evolution of gendered community engagement in UN peace operations, the facts and figures that may indicate a real progress and evolution from theory to practice. So really thinking about the way forward and implementation for each panelist, and then any closing remarks you'd like to share. Thank you.
Okay, I would like to say that it is important to improve the training, the pre-deployment training, as we were speaking today. This is maybe one of the most important things to look forward to receive a good training, a pre-deployment training with the chain of command, as we were saying with Colonel Mila, and to continue that during the mission, and maybe to receive the feedback at the end of the mission, so we can just take notes of the lessons learned and to share it to the next training, and so on, so on.
Colonel Mila, if you want to answer any of the question about the way forward, as well as any closing remarks.
Yes, okay. Just emphasize, as I'm going to say about training, it is very important at the level. Remember that the engagement platoon is part of the battalion. It is not an independent platoon. They work together. They are part of the battalion operation. They should be composed by special skill. We don't need, and I'm trying to answer one question coming from my colleague Marcelo from Brazil. We don't need infantry warriors in the engagement platoon. We need people with a specific skill to conduct engagement. What we are doing here in Uruguay? We are trying to recruit people from the administrative side, from the sanitary side, from the logistics side, providing basic skill to be able to protect themselves, and with that capability, they will be able to be deployed within the infantry battalion. I think that could be a good thing. And the other thing is we need dedicated team, no part-time team, as we had to do in Uruguay sometime, because this is related with the mission that we are doing as a reserve, but we need dedicated team, engagement platoon, within the organization of the battalion, having contact at the specific staff of the unit, and supporting the mission in the field. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Colonel Tutton, if you want to think about the way forward and any closing remarks.
Well, my way forward is I have to get the EP handbook finalized and signed by the Undersecretary General of DPO, as well as finalize that reinforcement training package with our integrated training service, and of course with the Canadians in Uruguay in that working group. So that's the very short, in close task that I have. But looking a little further out, we are also putting into this timeline the ability to speak with, say, Lieutenant Amakoni's engagement platoon in a lessons learned conference, where we will bring them in person to have that very detailed discussion. I don't know which units or member states would be willing to do that. I don't have that exactly penned into the timeline yet, but we are looking at that. It is in our terms of reference. External or within OMA, the other responsibility I have is to work with our force generators on how the infantry battalions are generated going forward, as well as with the military planners, to make sure that it is part of the SURs, the MOUs, and part of the CONOPS under the protection of civilians, where they have that type of text and language in there. Outside of OMA, continuing to work with the member states and the TCCs to better help them understand the engagement platoon up through into the infantry battalion, and what the expectations are. And then as far as the analysis, that's something I'm going to have to continue to look at. A4P plus the plan going forward on the monitoring mechanism, as well as the A4P agenda, has some language reference engagement teams, platoons in there. The C34 language always has something, and sometimes we have some pretty healthy debates on what it should say and what it does say. So those are some of the things, but I have taken a note to talk about some of that data collection and how we can get to some of that disaggregated data to allow for better analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Tutton. And Gretchen, we will give you the last word to answer the question and any closing remarks or food for thought for our very active audience.
Thanks so much, Phoebe. I've been frantically scribbling some thoughts, so I'll try to be coherent here. So, I mean, the national realities of women's participation, I mean, it's such an important point, and it's one that is not necessarily even difficult to address. It can be frustrating because it requires patience. So I do want to highlight, not to be a shill, but I want to highlight the ELSI initiative here, as well as the ELSI initiative fund. So when we're talking, we can get really granular, as we have, about engagement platoons and engagement teams. And then as we make the link out then to the importance of changes at the national level, there's a lot of really excellent research going on under the ELSI initiative on this topic. So Amanda or Pashea, I know my colleagues who are on this call, I wonder if we can link to DCAF's barrier assessment. DCAF in Geneva has put together a really excellent barrier assessment looking at barriers to women's full, meaningful participation. I know these terms have sort of lost a little bit of their punch in recent years, but DCAF has really created an incredible tool. And so I would encourage TCCs to undertake the barrier assessment as part of getting to the point where we can have a consistent enough deployment of women that we don't have to worry about whether there will be enough women in specialized roles, non-administrative roles, to make engagement platoons a reality and a success. So that's one thing. This is also the fact that it will take a long time for national realities to align with what we're calling for at the mission level. That sort of long look forward is why I continue to say that it's really important that we do not just ignore the ad hoc engagement teams that are currently patrolling, right? Like these teams are happening. They're doing a lot of really important work. They also lack guidance, and they lack reporting, consistent reporting mechanisms. They lack, sort of a lot of institutional support. And so, because I worry sometimes that maybe the attitude will become that engagement teams will obsolesce when engagement platoons roll out, and therefore we don't really need to pay them much attention, but we do. We need to continue monitoring what they're doing. We need to provide support. I'm saying we, but I'm one person. I'm happy to support however I can. I'm happy to have discussions with folks at the mission level about my own research. I hope that the report is useful in that regard. But I hope that there can be, more consistent sort of discussions between UNHQ, mission leadership, and, the TCC leadership as well, as far as the activities of ETs are concerned. So the final point really piggybacks on that. I do just want to highlight that in moving this from theory to practice, I really want to be putting forth practical research. So I'm available as a resource. Again, I'm one person, and I am a civilian, but I'm very happy to work with missions. It's been really great having a close relationship with UNOMA across this process, both for my own research, and I hope that some of my ideas and my sort of third-party perspective have been helpful. Making the links with other researchers working on related areas, for example, peacekeeping intelligence. The researchers working on the protection of civilians agenda, IPI will have a paper coming out pretty soon that I know touches, and we've published other reports in the past that really link POC with community engagement. So engaging with other researchers and continuing to sort of draw those connections between folks who are working on this And of course, having us as researchers connected to the mission level and the policymaking HQ level will be hugely important in that. So I, once again, just avail myself as a resource for this. I'm very happy to keep having these conversations. And thank you so much to everybody for engaging today and joining us. And yeah, for an incredibly active Q&A. Yeah, really appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you. I want to say a special thank you to our panelists. We so appreciate learning from you. A thank you to Gretchen for this research. And another reminder, please do look at the report. It's really a wonderful resource. Thank you to the team at IPI, and of course to the ELSI Initiative for supporting this research, and to our wonderful audience. We hope to continue engaging around this issue. Please find us on Twitter, on the IPI website, on any social media, and let's keep this conversation going. So thank you so much to everyone. Take care.